All right, so you ever hear about those people who just seem to have bad luck in relationships? You know, the ones who go through breakups like they're collecting loyalty points? Well, meet Betty Neumar, a woman who redefined unlucky, or, depending on how you look at it, got really good at making her husbands disappear. See, Betty didn't just go through a couple of messy divorces. No, every man she married ended up dead. And not just in a tragic accident kind of way. These guys were dropping under the sketchiest circumstances imaginable. 5 husbands. 5. At some point, you gotta ask, ma'am, are you secretly a hitman, or do you just have the deadliest wedding vows in history? Hooked already? Smash that subscribe button and stick with Tailscape. The craziest part? No one really caught on. Like, ever. This woman was out here casually racking up a body count while the rest of us were trying to figure out how to split the check on a first date. It wasn't until 2008, when she was well into her 70s, that authorities finally went, you know what? Maybe 5 dead husbands isn't just bad luck. But before we get to that, let's rewind all the way back, because Betty's story didn't start as a true crime podcast waiting to happen. She was born Betty Laphon Johnson in 1931 in Ironton, Ohio. Just your average small-town girl with big dreams. She wanted a good life, maybe a little money, and, oh yeah, a parade of mysteriously dead spouses. Her first husband was Clarence Malone. They got hitched in 1950 when Betty was just 19. And here's where things get interesting. Unlike her other husbands, Clarence actually survived their marriage. The two divorced in 1952, and Betty moved on. Clarence? Well, let's just say his good fortune ran out later. In 1970, 18 years after they split, Clarence was gunned down in a parking lot in Medina, Ohio. Someone really wanted him gone, but the case was never solved. Now at the time, Betty was nowhere near the crime scene, so nobody connected the dots. But knowing what we know now, this little coincidence is looking real suspicious. All right, moving on. Husband number 2, James Flynn. Betty married him in 1953, and yeah, you guessed it, by 1955, he was gone. This time, he was shot on a New York pier. And, not to sound insensitive, but at some point, wouldn't you start wondering why your spouses keep ending up full of holes? But no, Betty just kept it moving. Husband number 3, Richard Sills, married in 1956, and in 1967 he was found with a self-inflicted boomstick wound, allegedly, during an argument. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone tells me that a guy ended himself mid-fight, I'm gonna have some questions. But nope, ruled an accident, and Betty walked away without a scratch. And somehow, no one noticed that Betty was outliving every man she married like she had a secret deal with the Grim Reaper. At this point, Betty Neumar had already collected 3 late husbands, and somehow no one was seeing a pattern. But, she wasn't done yet. Enter husband number 4, Harold Gentry. They got married in 1968, and, well, you know where this is going. 18 years later, in 1986, Harold was found full of lead in their North Carolina home. But this time, Betty's luck finally started to crack. See, Harold wasn't just gone. His case was bizarre. He had been shot multiple times in what looked like an execution, and police found no signs of a break-in, which meant one thing: whoever did it knew him. And Betty? Well, she wasn't exactly mourning like a grieving widow. Witnesses later came forward saying that before Harold was taken out, Betty had been casually asking around if anyone knew someone who could take care of her husband. And by take care, I don't mean cook him dinner. I mean the other kind of permanent solution. One guy she allegedly approached, a former cop. Yeah, she literally tried hiring law enforcement to handle her business, because, you know, that's smart. The guy obviously didn't go through with it, but Betty? She just kept shopping around. But here's where it gets extra frustrating. Even with multiple witnesses saying Betty solicited a hitman, no arrests were made. That's right, she just walked away from her 4th husband's suspicious demise with no charges, no trial, and no consequences. And she still wasn't done. Fast forward to the 1990s. Betty had moved to Georgia and found husband number 5, John Neumar. Now, I don't know if this man did any background checks, but if he did, I assume Betty just handed him a resume that said, hobbies, gardening, knitting, definitely not outliving all my spouses. John and Betty stayed married for over a decade, the longest of all her marriages. But in 2007, John died, and Betty pulled her fastest move yet. The second he passed, she had him cremated immediately. No autopsy, no second opinions, just straight to the urn. And this time, people finally started asking questions. John's family wasn't buying the whole natural causes story. They started digging, and when they learned about Betty's history, the 5 husbands, the multiple suspicious deaths, the hitman rumors, they took their concerns straight to the police. This time, the authorities actually listened. Investigators in North Carolina, still haunted by Harold Gentry's very suspicious demise, decided to take another look at Betty. And what they found wasn't great for her. In 2008, 22 years after Harold Gentry's death, Betty Neumar was finally arrested and charged with solicitation to commit first-degree murder. It took decades, but law enforcement finally had her in cuffs. The media went insane. She was dubbed the Black Widow Granny, and every news outlet started digging into her past, pulling out every suspicious detail of her 5 marriages. For the first time, people started asking, was this really just bad luck? Or was Betty Neumar getting away with something? With Betty Neumar finally behind bars in 2008, it looked like the law had finally caught up with her. The media had a field day, splashing headlines like Black Widow Granny across every news channel. True crime fanatics were digging through her past, and investigators were working overtime trying to reopen the cases of her previous 4 husbands. But here's where things got messy. By the time police decided to really go after Betty, most of the evidence? Gone. Witnesses had moved on. Case files were dusty. And let's not forget, Betty was strategic. She had cremated at least one husband, John Neumar, and with the others, too much time had passed to gather anything solid. The one case they could build was the 1986 death of Harold Gentry. They had multiple people claiming Betty had been actively trying to hire someone to get rid of him. And yet, here's where things got frustrating. Those claims were decades old, which meant prosecutors still had an uphill battle proving them in court. But before they even got the chance, Betty pulled off her final escape. In 2011, while out on bail waiting for trial, Betty Neumar died of cancer in a Louisiana hospital. And just like that, no conviction, no sentencing, no real answers. She took everything to the grave. 5 husbands, 5 suspicious deaths, 0 accountability. And that's what makes this case so maddening. Every time she got close to being caught, she slipped away. Either there wasn't enough evidence or she beat the clock. The fact that she almost went to trial but died before facing justice just makes the whole thing feel like a bad joke. So, was Betty Neumar a cold, calculated mastermind? Or just a woman who somehow kept landing in the most suspicious circumstances ever? We'll never know. And that's what makes this story so infuriating. 5 husbands. 5. And somehow Betty Neumar walked free until the day she died. Thanks for tuning in to Talescape. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where the truth is way stranger than fiction.